When a soft-spoken man in worn jeans and a faded jacket stepped into one of Los Angeles's most exclusive restaurants, no one gave him a second glance except the waiter, who gave him a very specific look. One of annoyance. One of the assumptions. That man was Keanu Reeves. But the waiter didn't recognize him. Not with his hair pulled back in a low ponytail, no entourage, and no visible signs of wealth. To the staff, he was just another drifter trying to sit somewhere he clearly didn't belong. But what happened next would send shockwaves through the restaurant industry and deliver a lesson in dignity, humility, and respect that no one in that dining room would ever forget. Because Keanu didn't just leave quietly, he made one call. And within hours, the man who was turned away for not looking the part would reveal that he owned the very restaurant that rejected him. And the way he responded, not with rage, but with quiet strength, would inspire millions around the world. It was the kind of night that wrapped the city in gold. The kind where the air smelled faintly of wine and ambition. Outside the restaurant, black cars lined the curb, their windows dark, their drivers patient. Inside, the soft clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of laughter filled the space like a gentle tide, lapping at the marble floors and velvet booths. This place wasn't just a restaurant. It was a sanctuary for the rich and famous, a place where names mattered more than faces, and the right face could earn you a better table than any reservation ever could. So when the doors swung open with a quiet creak and a man stepped inside alone, no one paid him any real attention. He didn't walk like someone trying to impress. He didn't dress like someone trying to be seen. No flash, no jewelry, no designer logos screaming for attention. Just a plain black jacket, dark jeans, and boots that had carried him through 1,000 miles too many. He looked ordinary. The hostess at the front smiled by instinct, then blinked. Her eyes ran a silent scan. No tailored suit, no polished shoes, no watch sparkling under the chandelier light. She paused, fingers hovering just above the reservation book. The man stepped forward, his voice low and calm. "Evening. I was hoping I could get a table for one." She didn't respond right away. Her training told her to be polite, but something about him didn't quite fit the polished puzzle of the room. She glanced at the booths behind her, where influencers posed with martinis and executives leaned into deals sealed with $1,000 stakes. She smiled again, tighter this time. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "But I was in the area, thought I'd try my luck." Her hesitation was small but noticeable, the kind that said everything her lips didn't. A man like him? Here? She flipped a page in the book that didn't need flipping. "We're fully booked this evening, unfortunately." He nodded once, unfazed. "I understand." He turned slightly, giving her a way out. Maybe he already knew. Maybe he'd been through this before. Maybe he'd walked into places where the curtains were velvet but the respect was paper thin. And that's when Brad noticed him. Brad had worked here for 4 years. He'd served everyone from movie stars to moguls, memorizing names and preferences like a second language. He prided himself on reading people the moment they walked in, who mattered, who tipped well, and who was just pretending. This guy, Brad didn't even bother hiding his smirk. He leaned over the hostess stand. "Need help here?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She shook her head, but Brad was already stepping in. "Sir," he said, voice smooth as the champagne behind the bar. "Let me guess, walked in off the street, figured this looked like a good spot?" The man looked at him, expression unreadable. "I've heard good things." Brad nodded slowly, eyes flicking to the man's boots. "I bet you have. Great Yelp reviews. 5 stars. Just maybe not quite your crowd tonight." The man said nothing, just watched him. Brad chuckled, soft and condescending. "Hey, No shame in it. There's a great little place just 2 blocks down. More casual. Real cozy. I think you'd like it." The words weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They were dismissive. The kind that came with a look, one that said, "You don't belong here." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the suggestion. "Didn't realize there was a dress code." "There's not," Brad replied quickly. "Not exactly, but, we have standards." He said it with a smile, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. The man didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded again. "Appreciate your honesty." He turned, walking slowly toward the door, the same way he'd come in quietly, unbothered. And yet, something hung in the air. Not tension, not discomfort. Something deeper. The kind of silence that follows a mistake no one realizes they've made yet. Because at that moment, Brad didn't know who he was talking to. He just saw a man in jeans. But what he failed to see, what none of them saw, was that the man who had just been turned away owned the very restaurant they worked in. And he had just been told he didn't meet its standards. As the man took a slow step further inside, the air around him shifted, not because of anything he did, but because of what he didn't. He didn't try to impress. Didn't walk like he owned the place, even though he did. Didn't strut or shout or flash a black card like so many others did the moment they crossed this threshold. He simply stood there, hands calmly at his sides, eyes gently sweeping across the room, quietly absorbing the ambiance. And that's exactly why they looked at him the way they did. The first glance came from a couple near the window, mid-conversation over oysters and sparkling wine. The woman's eyes flicked up briefly and locked on him. Her brow arched, just slightly. She turned her head, whispered something to her partner behind the curve of her glass. He didn't look right away. He smirked first. The second glance came from a server, young, new, still learning the subtle signals of who to cater to and who to ignore. She hesitated with her tray of caviar and cocktails, eyes narrowing just slightly as she passed by him, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Something about him didn't compute. The clothes, the silence, the lack of urgency. He wasn't uncomfortable. He wasn't lost. But he also didn't fit. And then the third glance, that one came from Brad. Brad, with his cufflinks just a little too shiny and his cologne just a little too strong. He moved through the dining room like a man in a spotlight, more concerned with being seen than seeing. When he spotted the man near the host stand, something flickered in his expression. A smirk, perhaps. Or maybe it was just amusement dressed up as authority. He leaned over the counter again, whispering to the hostess in that not-so-subtle way he'd perfected over the years. "Who's that? He is looking for someone?" She shook her head. "Walk in. No reservation." Brad chuckled under his breath. Of course. The man hadn't moved. He stood politely, letting the staff decide whether he was worth their time. It was a dangerous game, and they didn't even know they were playing it. He didn't ask for a table again. He didn't raise his voice or wave them down. He waited, like a man who'd been patient his whole life. That, perhaps, was what confused them most. He didn't demand anything, but somehow he still made them uneasy. The disdain didn't come in words, not yet. It came in posture, in the way people adjusted their seating to avoid making eye contact. On the way, the hostess flipped through the reservation book that had already been closed. In the way Brad stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back, voice dripping with performative sympathy. "I'm afraid we're not accepting walk-ins tonight," Brad said, loud enough for a few tables to hear. "Very busy, you understand?" The man nodded once. Of course. Brad didn't leave it there. He never could. "It's just, you know how it is," he added, flashing a grin that wasn't really a grin. "We have a certain type of clientele. People expect a certain atmosphere." He said it gently, like he was doing the man a favor, like he was shielding him from something he wasn't ready for. The man didn't blink. "That's so." Brad gave a small shrug. "No offense." The most dangerous phrase in the English language, "no offense." Always said right before something offensive. Brad turned slightly, gesturing toward the door with subtle finality. "But there's a gastropub around the corner. Amazing burgers. Might be more your scene." A few guests were watching now. No one said anything. But you could feel it in the air, that invisible current of judgment that runs beneath a place like this. Whispers masquerading as thoughts. Looks that said everything mouths wouldn't dare. Still, the man remained composed. He glanced toward the dining room. He saw them watching. He saw the judgment, the assumption, the way everyone thought they knew who he was, based on the seams of his jacket and the wear in his boots. And then he looked back at Brad. "No problem," he said. "Appreciate your help." Brad gave a polite nod, already turning back toward his section, already forgetting him. To Brad, the moment was over. But the man lingered for just a second longer. Not to cause a scene, not to make a point, but because he saw something they didn't. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was his restaurant. And every single person judging him worked for him. The disdain he'd just tasted, it wasn't just personal. It was systemic, casual, routine. And as he turned to leave without a word of protest, the real story hadn't even started. Not yet. It wasn't said directly, but it didn't have to be. The words were already hanging in the air, invisible but heavy. "Do you even belong here?" Brad didn't ask it with his mouth. He asked it with his eyebrows, with the curve of his lips, with the way he stood half a step too tall in front of the man, chest puffed just enough to let him know where he stood. That smile, that polite, paper-thin smile, said everything. And the silence between them? That was the real message. The man didn't react. He didn't shrink or scowl. He just stood there, still and observant, the way someone does when they've heard this tune before. And he had too many times, in different places, under different disguises. Always the same song, different key. Brad cleared his throat. "You sure you're in the right place, sir?" His voice was light, almost friendly, but beneath it was a thrum of judgment that was impossible to miss. The man nodded slowly. "Pretty sure." Brad chuckled, stepping slightly to the side, as though subtly guiding him back toward the exit. "See, thing is, we get all kinds of people who want to check this place out. Big-name restaurant, all the buzz. But this isn't really a drop-in kind of spot." The man glanced toward the half-full tables, the open booths, the pristine white linens untouched at several corners of the room. "Looks like there's space." "There is," Brad replied quickly, "for the right guests." There it was. The phrase that said everything without saying anything. The right guests. The man's lips curled slightly, not into a smile, but into something more complicated. Amusement, maybe. Or recognition. "Didn't realize I needed to pass a test to eat." Brad crossed his arms, still grinning. "Not a test, just a standard, you understand." And still, the man didn't take the bait. He didn't raise his voice or press back. But the silence he left hanging was deliberate. It made Brad shift slightly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve like it would give him back control. "You're not in trouble," Brad added quickly, as if the man had done something wrong. "It's just that this place, it has a reputation. People come here expecting a certain level of elegance. And, well..." He let the sentence trail off. He didn't need to finish it. The man knew exactly what he was trying to say. The boots, the jacket, the absence of flash or name brands. That was all it took. That was all they saw. "Look, if it were up to me," Brad said, "I'd say go ahead. But I don't make the rules." The man finally smiled, just barely. Not because he found it funny, but because the irony was too thick not to taste. "No," he said, "you don't." Brad didn't catch it. He just nodded, pleased with how civil it had all been. "There's a great burger place a few blocks down. Real casual. You'd probably like it there." The man paused, taking one final look at the place, his place. The chandelier overhead, the polished bar, the paintings he'd chosen himself, the staff who didn't recognize him, the server trying to decide whether to laugh or stay silent. And then he turned back to Brad, his voice calm, even gentle. "I'll check it out," he said. "Thanks for the suggestion." He walked away like a man leaving a meeting, not a confrontation. But in his wake, the question Brad never really asked had already been answered. "Do you even belong here?" Yes, more than anyone else in the room. The room never got truly loud in a place like this. No one shouted across tables. No one laughed with abandon. It was all soft conversation and low music, the clinking of crystal and the brush of expensive cutlery. But somehow, the quiet made the whispers louder. They moved like static, curling between booths and behind menus never seen, but always felt. And tonight, there was a new whisper making the rounds. It started at table 7. A woman in a black dress leaned in, shielding her mouth with a folded menu as she spoke. Her eyes, though, didn't look at the man she was dining with. They drifted just beyond him, following the figure who'd just walked out of the restaurant. She murmured something too low to catch, but her companion chuckled, then turned to look. Just a glance. That's all it took. By the time the man had rounded the corner outside, heading slowly down the sidewalk, the whisper had reached table 4, then table 2. A waiter carried it next, unintentionally, as he passed it along with a fresh round of drinks. Someone at the bar tilted their head. "Did you see him?" a man asked, voice hushed but urgent. "Guy in the worn jacket, no reservation." "I thought he was a delivery guy," someone replied. "Nah, just tried to walk in and eat." A beat. And Brad turned him away? Obviously. There was no need to ask why. In places like this, the reasons didn't need to be said. Everyone already knew them. You could dress it up as policy or atmosphere, but deep down, it was about expectation, about image, the illusion of exclusivity. A few of the newer staff exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't been here long, but long enough to understand how it worked. Brad had been clear during training. Know who the regulars are, who the critics might be, who belongs and who doesn't. But what no one seemed to be asking, not yet, was the question that would change everything. What if Brad got it wrong? A bartender named Luis was the first to feel it. He watched the man walk out, then looked down at the drink he was polishing. Something tugged at the edge of memory. He couldn't place it, not yet, but it nagged at him like a song you can't quite remember the lyrics to. He nudged his coworker. "Hey, you see that guy?" "Who, the one Brad turned away?" "Yeah." Luis hesitated. "He looked familiar, right?" The other bartender shrugged. "Maybe. Didn't get a good look." Luis frowned, his eyes drifting back to the door the man had left through. Then, from the far corner booth table 1, the best seat in the house, a hand went up. A woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and quiet, signaled her waiter. When he arrived, she didn't ask for dessert. She asked a question. "Who was that man?" The waiter blinked. "Sorry, ma'am." "The one in the gray jacket," she said. "Who left a few minutes ago. Looked like he was about to sit, then walked out." He stammered. "Oh, just a walk-in. No reservation. Brad handled it." She nodded once, slowly, then picked up her spoon again. But her eyes didn't leave the door. And now the whisper wasn't just judgment. It was curiosity, doubt, suspicion. Because the man hadn't stormed out or protested. He'd said thank you. He'd smiled. He'd left with dignity. And dignity like that, it doesn't grow in the shallow soil of insecurity. It comes from deeper roots, the kind that make people wonder, who was he, really? Brad didn't notice the shift. He was too busy retelling the moment like a victory. "You should have seen him," he said, laughing softly with another server. "Didn't even try to argue. Probably realized he was out of his league." But even as he spoke, the whisper behind the menu was changing. It no longer asked why the man came. It asked what they'd just lost by letting him leave. By the time the man reappeared, the restaurant had already begun to settle into its usual rhythm again, forks dancing lightly against porcelain, laughter diluted by fine wine, and conversations just loud enough to remind you that this was a place where people felt important simply by being seated. But none of that distracted Luis when he saw the door swing open again. He blinked. That man was back. Same jacket, same boots, same quiet eyes. Luis paused mid-pour, the foam from a draft settling like a crown in the untouched glass. He watched as the man stepped in, not hesitantly, not boldly, but with the same even grace he had before, like someone who didn't need permission to breathe in a room built on judgment. But this time, the air shifted. A couple near the window recognized him first. Not completely just a flicker of memory behind their eyes, a tilt of the head, a murmur passed between them. Then another man at the bar looked up. His eyes narrowed. The whisper that had barely died out began to stir again, like embers catching wind. Brad was mid-conversation when he noticed. He turned, spotting the familiar figure. And that same smirk twitched onto his face, the one that had no idea how far off it really was. "Well," he said, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. "Guess he didn't take the hint." He stepped forward like a man owning the moment, like this was his stage, and the second act had just arrived to give him a standing ovation. But before he could speak, the man raised a hand not to stop him, but to gently acknowledge someone behind him. It wasn't Brad. It was Michelle, the restaurant manager. She'd just stepped out from the back, her eyes scanning the floor with instinctive precision, making the kind of micro-adjustments that only someone in charge noticed. A chair pushed too far, a napkin folded slightly off-center. Her gaze found him, and something in her posture changed. It wasn't dramatic, just a pause, a flicker, like she'd registered a forgotten face and was trying to pull it forward through fog. The man gave a small nod and walked toward her, stepping past Brad without even looking at him. That simple act, that effortless bypass, knocked the air out of Brad's ego like a sudden gust. Excuse me, sir?" Brad called after him. The man didn't stop, didn't speed up either. He simply reached Michelle, who was already moving toward him now, her expression shifting rapidly from professional neutrality to something else, respect. Or maybe realization. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice steady but gentler than Brad's had ever been. The man smiled. "Would you mind if I spoke to the head chef for a moment? Just a quick word. I promise I won't take up much of their time." Michelle blinked. Not because the request was outrageous, it wasn't, but because of the way it was asked. Politely, calmly, like someone used to getting told no but never needing to shout to hear yes. "Of course," she said, already turning. "He's prepping for the final seating, but I'm sure he'd be happy to wait." She stopped. Her eyes met his. long enough to register what her brain had just caught up with. "You're—" The man held up a hand, his smile deepening with warmth rather than pride. "Just someone who appreciates a good risotto," he said. Michelle's breath hitched in her throat. She laughed, too soft to be heard by anyone else, and nodded once. "I'll get him." As she disappeared into the kitchen, the room hadn't yet caught on. But a few guests had. Luis definitely had. And Brad, he was frozen in place, watching the man he thought he'd dismissed now being escorted to the back of the house by the woman who ran it. He didn't sit. He didn't make a scene. He simply stood by the wall, hands behind his back, waiting patiently, like a man waiting not to demand anything, but to offer something. Because Keanu Reeves hadn't come to eat. He'd come to make a quiet request, one that would turn the entire restaurant on its head. Behind the counter, the staff was watching. They didn't mean to, not all of them. Some were genuinely caught mid-shift, wiping down glasses or prepping the next round of amuse-bouches. But it's hard to ignore when something begins to feel off-script. And this moment? This wasn't in the usual playbook of Friday night fine dining. A man who had just been turned away had returned not through the front door as a lost patron begging for a seat, but through a different kind of entrance entirely. A conversation with the manager, a nod from the head chef. The kind of things that didn't just happen to nobodies. Brad was trying to play it cool, but the corners of his composure were starting to fray. He leaned against the counter near the server station, pretending to check the table assignments on the screen, but his eyes kept drifting back to the hallway leading to the kitchen. Every now and then he'd scoff, hoping someone would ask what was so funny. Finally, someone did. Marcy, a hostess barely out of college, walked over with a smirk tucked into the side of her mouth. "So, your guy's back." Brad gave a low laugh. "Yeah, guess he didn't take rejection well." Another server, Neil, slid in beside them with an arched eyebrow. "Back and chatting with Michelle. Not bad for a guy in boots from like 2004. That's when it started. The snickering. Not cruel, not loud, but sharp enough to cut. The kind of laughter people save for someone they've already decided isn't one of them. It wasn't about what the man had said or even done. It was about the way he looked, the way he didn't fit, in a place where fit was everything. "Maybe he's a food critic," Marcy teased. "Please," Brad muttered. "You ever see a critic without a tailored blazer and 3 phones?" "He did walk in like he owned the place," Neil added, with a chuckle that landed heavier than it should have. Brad shook his head, but the line struck a chord. Owned the place. That was rich. "He's probably one of those guys who reads Yelp reviews for fun and thinks he knows cuisine," Brad said, relishing the way the others leaned in closer, feeding off his confidence. "Michelle's just humoring him. Give it 5 minutes, she'll realize it was a waste of time." Another small ripple of laughter passed between them. It felt safe, dismissive. But none of them noticed Luis, quietly polishing a glass at the edge of the bar, saying nothing. Luis had served long enough to learn when to stay quiet. And something about the way the man had returned the steady gait, the quiet request, the way Michelle's expression had shifted when she recognized him, it gnawed at him. There was a weight behind that calm. Not arrogance. Something deeper. Like a man used to silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood the power of waiting. Still, the snickers grew. By the time the kitchen doors swung open again and Michelle returned, the staff had moved on to predictions. "He probably asked to speak to the chef about the seasoning," Neil said, rolling his eyes. "Watch him offer to consult." "Maybe he's trying to get a free meal out of guilt," Marcy added. "Like, sorry I tried to sneak in. Here's my sob story." Brad laughed, a little too loud. "I'll bet you $20 he complains on Instagram tonight." But the laughter stopped the moment Michelle passed them. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't frowning either. Just moving quickly, professionally, her face unreadable in the way only people in charge have perfected. She didn't glance at Brad. She didn't glance at anyone. She just said, calmly, "Luis, can you bring a glass of the 2005 Bordeaux to the back, please?" Luis blinked. "To the chef?" She paused, then looked at him, this time letting a small smile rise in her eyes. "To our guest." And with that, she disappeared again. Brad's jaw tightened. The others didn't laugh this time. No one made a joke, because suddenly, the snickering didn't feel like confidence anymore. It felt like the first mistake in a story they were no longer in control of. Brad had always considered himself good at reading people. It was part of the job, after all, gauging which guests wanted conversation, which wanted silence, which ones needed the illusion of superiority spoon-fed to them alongside their seared foie gras. He prided himself on poise, decisiveness, the kind of subtle confidence that only flourished in environments like this one, where every glance meant something and every detail was a test. So when he spotted the man again, that man being quietly led to a table near the back, something in Brad snapped like a taut string. He'd watched the glass of Bordeaux vanish into the kitchen minutes earlier. Had seen Luis return with a stiff expression, his lips sealed tight, like someone who had been given just enough information to make silence feel like the safer choice. And now Michelle had done the unthinkable. She'd given that man no reservation, no designer clothes, no outward signs of worth a table. Brad couldn't let it go. He wiped his hands on his apron, his mind already spinning with rationale. He'd just check in. That's all. He'd walk over, pretend to be gracious, pretend he was simply ensuring that everyone received the same standard of care. But really he wanted confirmation. He needed to see it up close to prove that his instinct had been right. That this guy didn't belong here, that whatever strings were being pulled in the background, they weren't earned. So he made his way to the table, a smooth glide perfected over hundreds of shifts. His smile was pleasant, practiced, the kind of smile people mistake for warmth, until they realize it doesn't touch the eyes. "Good evening, sir," Brad said, the words coming out too polished, too rehearsed. "Can I help you with anything?" The man looked up from the menu, his eyes calm and steady. Not surprised, not grateful, just present. It was unnerving. "No, thank you," the man replied gently. "I'm all right." Brad hesitated. "I just wanted to make sure everything was to your liking. You weren't on the reservation list, and, well, we like to keep things consistent here." The implication hung in the air like perfume that was just a little too strong. The man's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. "Consistency is good," he said, "but sometimes a little variation reveals what's real underneath." Brad didn't like that. He didn't like the way the man spoke, like every word had been chosen carefully, not to impress, but to disarm. It made the usual power dance harder to perform. So he took a step closer, lowering his voice slightly. "It's just that we typically have a strict reservation policy. High demand, limited space, you understand?" "I do," the man said, nodding once. "It's a beautiful place. I'm sure you're proud of it." That stopped Brad for a second. There was no sarcasm in the tone, no jab hidden in the compliment. Just sincerity, and somehow that felt worse. "Right," Brad said, resetting. "Well, I'll give you a few more minutes with the menu. Let me know if you need help deciding. We have some excellent chef recommendations tonight." He turned to leave, expecting the man to say thank you, or even just nod. Instead, the man asked quietly, "What do you recommend?" Brad blinked. He hadn't expected that. He paused, caught between the reflex of service and the urge to reassert control. "Personally," he said, recovering, If it's your first time here, maybe the duck confit. It's hard to mess that one up. The word slipped out too fast, too sharp. He regretted it immediately but didn't show it. Couldn't. The man simply tilted his head, studying him for a long moment. Not offended, not angry, just measuring. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll keep that in mind." Brad offered a tight nod and left before the silence between them got any louder. As he returned to the server station, something inside him twisted. Not guilt exactly, but an unfamiliar discomfort. Because he hadn't just dismissed a guest. He'd tried to put someone in their place. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he knew where that place really was. The room hummed with the low thrum of cutlery and curated conversation. Every detail inside the restaurant had been designed to impress. Not with opulence, but with confidence, the kind of quiet luxury that whispered instead of shouted. Tables were spaced just right. Music played just soft enough. Lighting fell in golden waves over cream tablecloths and polished glassware. In a space where nothing was ever left to chance, a misstep was more than a flaw, it was a rupture. And right now, the rupture had a shape. It looked like the man seated near the back. He was calm, still, unbothered. But that only made it worse for Brad, who stood behind the server station, trying to figure out when the whole evening had started slipping away from him. It wasn't just the man's return or the fact Michelle had given him a table. It was where she had seated him. That table. Table 8. It wasn't marked as reserved in the system anymore. Michelle had cleared it herself, but everyone knew it had been promised. A long-time regular. The kind of client whose last name didn't need to be spoken because it came with a preferred bottle and an unspoken rule. When he came in, that table was his. Always. Brad checked the clock. Any minute now. Luis passed by, balancing a tray with a bottle of sparkling water and a single flute. He glanced at Brad but said nothing. The air was too tense for small talk now. Across the room, Marcy leaned toward the host's stand and whispered to another staff member. They both glanced toward table 8. The man was sipping water, looking around, observing without judgment, like someone who didn't need to measure the room because he already knew how it worked. Brad's chest tightened. This wasn't just about one customer anymore. This was a storm building just beneath the surface, and it was about to break. The door swung open with the soft chime that was barely heard over the jazz, but Brad noticed instantly. He looked up and there he was. Mr. Delaney. Tall, pressed suit, gold cufflinks that caught the light when he adjusted his sleeves. A man who didn't need to ask for attention. It followed him like a loyal pet. Brad straightened. So did Marcy. "Good evening, Mr. Delaney," she greeted with the kind of practiced brightness that teetered between genuine and strategic. "Welcome back." "Evening," he said. "Table 8, I assume?" And there it was. The question that didn't sound like one. Brad stepped forward, already halfway through his apology in his head, when Michelle appeared from the side hallway. Her presence, always composed, suddenly felt like a shield being raised. "Mr. Delaney?" she said warmly. "It's lovely to see you." He smiled. "Pleasure's mine. Shall we?" She paused, and that pause was a sound in itself. "I actually made a last-minute change tonight," she said gently. "I do apologize, we had an unexpected situation. Would you mind joining us at table 12? It's just as comfortable and a bit more private." Brad held his breath. Delaney blinked. His expression didn't crack, but there was a flicker of disbelief. "That's new," he said quietly. Michelle's smile didn't falter. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it would be a better experience." He looked past her, straight toward table 8. Saw the man sitting there. No laptop, no phone. Just a menu in his hands, and an unreadable stillness in his posture. "Who's that?" Delaney asked, voice low. "A guest," Michelle replied simply. "One whose evening I'd like to preserve." There was no challenge in her voice, just decision. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink. Delaney nodded once. Not happily, but accepting. "All right," he said, "but I'll expect the wine to match." "Of course," Michelle said, gesturing for Marcy to guide him to his new seat. As they walked away, Brad stayed frozen. He'd never seen Delaney moved, not once, and certainly not without some kind of negotiation. Yet Michelle had done it in a single breath. He turned toward table 8 again. The man was now folding the menu, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just been handed a table meant for someone who spent more in a night than most did in a month. Brad's thoughts turned heavy, because for the second time that evening, someone had made room for a man they hadn't planned on, and no one seemed to be asking why. Brad stood near the edge of the server's station, his fingers pressed against the polished wood as if it might ground him. He wasn't moving anymore, wasn't fetching wine, wasn't delivering entrees, wasn't floating between tables with his usual controlled grace. He was just standing there, watching, listening, thinking. He hadn't meant to lose control of the night. It had started like any other tight, rehearsed professional. His jacket was pressed, his demeanor cool, his rhythm predictable. But somewhere between the man walking in and Delaney being led to table 12, something had broken off script, something intangible. Brad had always believed in the order of things. You work your way up, you learn the steps, you earn the right to command a space. In this restaurant, hierarchy wasn't written on a whiteboard, it was felt, understood. The weight of who belonged where, who deserved attention, who should be served with a bow, and who with a side glance. That was the unwritten choreography. And this man, this ordinary soft-spoken figure at table 8, had thrown the whole thing into question. The worst part wasn't that Brad had misread him. It was that everyone else had adjusted so quickly. Michelle had changed seating arrangements for him. Luis had brought him vintage wine without hesitation. Even Delaney, a man who once demanded a different server because his appetizer arrived 7 minutes late, had accepted the shift without pushback. And Brad? He was left standing, still, exposed. He thought back to his interaction with the man. The quietness. The way his questions hadn't been laced with ego but with awareness. He hadn't needed validation. He hadn't demanded anything. He had simply sat. And in doing so, somehow, everything around him had tilted. Brad clenched his jaw, the familiar tension returning to his shoulders. 100 little things needed doing, but none of them felt urgent anymore, not compared to the low, insistent voice in the back of his head. You dismissed him. You looked him in the eye and decided he didn't matter. That kind of mistake lingers. He didn't notice Marcy approach until she nudged him with a stack of menus. "Hey, you okay?" Brad blinked. "Yeah, just thinking." Marcy glanced toward table 8, then back to him. "He's interesting, huh?" Brad didn't answer. The word didn't feel right. Interesting was what you said when you didn't understand someone but didn't want to admit it. Marcy tilted her head. Michelle seems to know him. That thought landed heavier than it should have. Michelle didn't just know people. She curated. She filtered. For her to give someone that kind of trust meant something more than familiarity, it meant respect. And respect was earned in this place. Brad exhaled, pushing away from the counter. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted his apron, and walked back toward the floor, not toward table 8, not yet, but toward something steadier. He wasn't sure what he was going to do next. Maybe just take care of the guests he'd neglected. Maybe just listen a little harder. He hadn't lost his position, not officially. But something had shifted in him. a crack in the certainty that had always guided his posture and his tone. He wasn't defeated, not the kind of defeat you show in your body, but there was a quiet deflation in his pride, a hollowing out of the assurance he wore like armor. Still, he kept moving, because service didn't stop for reflection. And maybe that was the only way forward, one plate, one step, one decision at a time. From the corner of the room, the man at table 8 watched the staff in their orchestrated motion. He didn't seem proud or smug. He wasn't looking to win. He simply existed in a way that demanded people reckon with their assumptions. Brad had been left standing, but maybe that was exactly what he needed. A moment without the protection of routine, a moment to see himself more clearly. Michelle had always walked with the kind of precision that made people clear a path without knowing why. Not rushed, never flustered, she moved like someone who had already accounted for every possible variable in her head. It was the mark of someone who had kept a place like this running for years without a single scandal or social media slip-up. But tonight, there was something different in her pace. She wasn't hurrying, but she wasn't floating either. Her heels clicked a little harder against the floor. Her spine was straighter than usual. There was no tray in her hand, no list, no clipboard, just intent. Brad noticed before anyone else. He watched her emerge from the private stairwell near the wine cellar, where she sometimes took her calls when she didn't want to be overheard. She wasn't smiling, and Michelle always smiled. Even when reprimanding a staff member, she wore a version of it soft, professional, distracting. Now, her face was unreadable. Luis caught it too. He nudged Marcy subtly with his elbow. Their conversation dropped off, replaced by the kind of silence that meant something's happening. Michelle scanned the room with a calm sweep of her eyes, taking inventory. The usual suspects: Delaney sipping his second glass, the fashion influencer with her 2-ring light setup tucked beneath the table, the tech exec holding court near the fireplace, and then her gaze fell back to him. Table 8. The man was still seated, fingers loosely clasped, a half-finished glass of wine in front of him. His demeanor hadn't changed in the slightest. He wasn't restless. He wasn't scrolling on his phone or looking around for validation. He was just there, like a pillar in the center of a building no one had realized was built around him. Michelle approached the table with measured steps. Brad leaned in ever so slightly, watching from his corner. He couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He recognized the body language. Michelle didn't bow, didn't lean, didn't soften. She stood with the same posture she gave to visiting dignitaries and discreet investors, the kind of stance that said, "I know who you are, and I'm here because I respect the weight you carry." The man gave a small nod in response to whatever she said. Not the kind of nod that ends a conversation, the kind that starts one. They spoke in quiet tones for the next minute or two. No grand gestures, no shifting glances, just words exchanged like currency. At one point, Michelle's hand moved to her chest briefly, as if offering a promise. And then she smiled, really smiled, in a way Brad hadn't seen all evening. When she turned to leave, her expression was reset, but her pace was different again, lighter, like something important had just been handled. She made her way to the server's station where Brad, Luis, and Marcy tried to look busier than they were. "Everything all right?" Brad asked, voice neutral. Michelle looked at him, then at the others. "Yes," she said, "but from here on out, no one touches table 8 without checking with me first." Her tone wasn't sharp, but it wasn't open to debate either. Luis raised an eyebrow. "Is he a critic? Like some kind of food blog thing?" Michelle gave the faintest smile. "Something like that." And then she walked away, just like that, back into the rhythm of the restaurant, as though she hadn't just issued an unspoken order that altered the rules of engagement. Brad felt it like a ripple beneath his skin. Because it wasn't just that the man was important, It was that Michelle knew exactly how important, and she wasn't saying, which meant he wasn't just another guest. He was the guest. And now, the whole room would shift around him, whether it realized it or not. The words weren't spoken loudly. They didn't need to be. In a place like this where elegance was measured in restraint and power dressed itself in understatement, a whisper could cut deeper than a shout. Brad stood frozen, not out of fear, but disbelief. It had been less than 5 minutes since Michelle had issued her quiet decree about Table 8. No one touches him, no one interrupts. But now, here she was again, standing near the entrance of the lounge corridor, speaking with that same composed tone, but it had taken on a weight that hadn't been there before. The man across from her, young, overdressed, smelling faintly of ambition, and something sharper, didn't seem to understand, or didn't want to. His name was Tyler. He came in once every 2 weeks, always with someone new on his arm, always pretending not to notice the looks he got from other tables. He was charming in the way people are when they know charm is all they have left to offer. Tonight, he'd come alone. At first. He was seated at Table 9, a few feet away from the quiet man at Table 8. He'd ordered the chef's tasting without looking at the menu, made a show of recommending wine to himself out loud. When the quiet man had arrived, Tyler had glanced at him once and dismissed him just as quickly. But something about that dismissal hadn't stuck. Halfway through his second course, Tyler had leaned back in his chair, thrown a glance toward the staff station, and called Brad over with a casual snap. "Hey," he said. "Table 8, do we do walk-ins now? Thought this place had standards?" Brad had swallowed whatever response wanted to come out. "All guests are seated at the manager's discretion," he'd said, keeping his voice even. Tyler had smirked. "Right, discretion. That's what we're calling it." He didn't push further then, but the air around him shifted. His eyes flicked to Table 8 repeatedly after that, narrowing each time, as if watching someone he couldn't quite categorize, couldn't predict. And then, without warning, Tyler stood up. He didn't walk to the restroom. He didn't head toward the front. He took a detour, subtle at first, meandering through tables until he was just a step away from the quiet man's seat. His hand brushed the back of the chair. He leaned in slightly. Brad saw it from across the room. So did Luis. So did Michelle. The words weren't loud enough to carry, but the tone was unmistakable. Tyler was saying something, smirking, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. And then came Michelle. Not from behind the bar, not from her office. From the floor, fast, silent, efficient, like she'd already been expecting this. She stepped between the two men so precisely it looked choreographed. "Mr. Tyler," she said quietly, "I'm afraid you'll have to leave." There it was. Not a question, not an offer. Tyler blinked. "Excuse me? You're making another guest uncomfortable. We don't tolerate that." He laughed, but it was the nervous kind. "I wasn't doing anything. I was just saying hi. Is that illegal now?" Michelle didn't flinch. "It's not about the words. It's about the intention. And I don't need a legal code to protect the environment we cultivate here." Brad held his breath. Tyler looked around, searching for an ally, someone to side with him. But there was no one. Even Marcy had turned away, busying herself with silverware that didn't need rearranging. "You're serious?" he asked, voice tightening. "I am," Michelle said. "Your bill is taken care of, but you won't be returning." Tyler stared at her, then at the man behind her, still seated, still silent, still utterly unmoved. He didn't argue, not because he agreed, but because something in Michelle's presence told him that pushing further wouldn't end well. He straightened his jacket, gave a small scoff, and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him, soft and final. Michelle turned back toward the floor as if nothing had happened. But Brad saw at the glance she gave to table 8, a nod of reassurance, a silent acknowledgement. And the man? He just lifted his glass and sipped. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but the energy in the room shifted, like the sudden silence that follows the moment a conductor raises their hand before the first note. Tense, alert, waiting. Table 8 remained unchanged. The man sitting there didn't celebrate, didn't smirk, didn't raise an eyebrow in triumph. He simply went on with his wine, fingers lightly resting on the stem of the glass, his eyes lowered, not avoiding attention, but not inviting it either. Michelle's heels clicked softly as she made her way back to the service station, her face composed. Not cold, not warm, just still. Her movements remained fluid, her gaze forward. But beneath it all, something had shifted, and Brad felt it like static on his skin. Luis whispered, "Did you see that?" under his breath. Brad didn't answer. He didn't need to. They'd all seen it. They'd all felt it. A few of the diners looked up from their plates, curiosity veiled behind polite glances. A woman at table 3 leaned in closer to her husband, asking a question too quietly to hear. A pair of younger men at the bar exchanged glances over the rim of their whiskey glasses. No one dared stare, but the weight of the moment hung just under the surface. For most of them, it wasn't clear what had just happened. A well-dressed regular escorted out of the building, no scene, no noise, just gone. But they felt the tremor left behind, the sense that something important had just taken place and they'd almost missed it. At the service station, Michelle met Brad's eyes. She didn't speak, but in the way her gaze lingered just for a second, he understood. "Now do you see?" Brad swallowed hard. The truth was starting to settle in. Not the obvious truth that the man at table 8 had influence. That was already clear. But something deeper. Something earned. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't fought back when dismissed. He hadn't demanded recognition when disrespected. He just waited. And now, the restaurant itself was adjusting around him. Brad glanced toward Marcy, who was carefully arranging napkins that were already perfectly placed. She noticed him watching and gave a nervous smile. "Feels different in here, doesn't it?" she murmured. He nodded. "Yeah, like we've all been caught doing something we shouldn't." She chuckled softly, but it faded just as fast. Because it was true. The laughter earlier. The snide remarks. The subtle snickers. Every little gesture now felt louder in hindsight. And still, the man at table 8 said nothing. It was that silence that unnerved them the most. Not because it was cold or punishing, but because it offered no defense for them to reject or argue with. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He didn't need to. A new server walked in, someone covering the late shift. She hadn't seen what had happened. Her eyes moved quickly across the room, noting open tables, scanning the list in her hand. She paused as she glanced at table 8. "Who's he?" she asked casually. 3 people turned to her in unison. Luis gave the smallest shake of his head. "Don't worry about it. Just don't go near him." The server blinked. "Why? Is he a celebrity?" Marcy looked down, smoothing a wrinkle in the service cloth. "Worse. He's someone who already knows who you are before you even open your mouth." That shut down the conversation. Michelle returned a few minutes later, but not alone. A man in a tailored navy suit followed her, darker skin, gray at his temples, eyes sharp. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't staff. He looked like someone who had come from an office, not a kitchen or a dining room. Corporate, maybe. Operations. One of those men you never saw unless something had gone wrong or something very important was happening. They approached table 8 together. Michelle gestured softly with one hand, deferring without groveling. The man in the suit spoke briefly, barely moving his mouth. The man at table 8 simply listened, then nodded. The suited man placed something on the table. A business card? A note? Then, with a short bow of his head, he turned and left as quietly as he'd come. Michelle lingered a moment longer, exchanging only a few more words, and then she too stepped back, letting the moment dissolve into the night. Brad watched all of it. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But inside, something was undoing itself quietly, steadily. He had served hundreds of people here, maybe thousands, but not like this, not like him. And it was no longer about what the man had said. It was what he hadn't. The silence said everything. It began with a vibration, subtle, almost forgettable. Michelle felt it in the inside pocket of her blazer, where her phone always rested during shifts screen off, sound muted. Only the smallest tremor against fabric signaling that something required her attention. She didn't check it right away. Not in front of guests. That was the unspoken rule, an extension of the atmosphere she helped maintain. But the second she rounded the corner back into the corridor behind the bar, her hand was already moving. She unlocked the screen with a glance, and there it was. Call him. Now. No name. Just the message. Just those 3 words. But Michelle knew exactly who it was from. Only 3 people in the company had her private work number. One was a silent partner who hadn't texted in years. The other was the operations executive who had just left the restaurant floor 10 minutes ago. And the last was him. Michelle's throat tightened. She'd known this moment would come. Eventually. You don't work for a place like this, for a man like him, without expecting the day your decisions ripple back to the top. Still, it didn't make pressing the call button any easier. The line rang once, twice, then a click. Silence. No hello. No introduction. He didn't need to. She spoke first, keeping her voice steady. I assume you've been informed. Another beat of silence. Then the voice came through low, patient, calm. Yes. Michelle exhaled quietly, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. I handled it. I know. Another pause. This one longer. He wasn't angry. That much was clear. But there was something in his voice. Not approval, not disappointment. Just thoughtfulness. Observation. Like someone who was still taking in the full shape of what had happened. Do you want me to explain? No. It wasn't dismissive. If anything, it was respectful. An understanding between professionals. She had made a call, and he trusted her enough not to require a justification. But then he added, walk me through it anyway. So she did. From the moment the guest had arrived, to the way the staff had reacted, to the laughter she hadn't stopped quickly enough, to the man at table 9 and his approach to table 8, and her decision to remove him. She laid it all out plainly, no embellishment, no excuse. When she finished, there was only the faint sound of his breath over the line. Then he said, and the man? She swallowed. Still seated, still quiet. That made him chuckle soft, amused, but barely audible. Of course he is, he murmured. Michelle hesitated. Do you want me to say something? To him? No. Her eyes flicked toward the camera screen in the corner of the corridor, the one showing the live feed from the dining room. She saw him there, still at table 8, still untouched by the chaos his presence had caused. He didn't reveal anything, she said. Not even when Tyler got close. I know he didn't, came the reply. He wouldn't. That silence again. Then a shift. A different tone in his voice now. Something warmer, fonder. "You know, it's been years since he visited in person," he said. Michelle's brows lifted slightly. "Why tonight?" A pause. "I think he wanted to be reminded." Reminded of what? That people still see him as a man, not just a myth. Michelle stood there, absorbing that. And then, almost instinctively, she asked, "Did we fail him?" There was no hesitation in the response. "No. You reminded him exactly why he built that place the way he did." Michelle didn't reply, but something in her chest released. The voice on the phone softened. "He won't stay much longer. Let him leave the way he came. Quietly." "Of course," she said. And just before the line went dead, he added one last thing. "Thank you for protecting his peace." Click. It came slowly, like fog rolling in beneath the glow of golden chandeliers, silent and steady. Not with a shout, not with a flourish. Just a whisper at first. Luis was the first to hear it. He'd just stepped back from the espresso machine when someone near the bar leaned in, murmured something under their breath, and watched Luis's expression shift like a fault line cracking. He didn't respond right away. He just stared, then blinked, then leaned closer. "Say that again?" The guest, a regular, a quiet man known for his imported cigars and old-world manners, simply tapped his phone screen, tilted it toward Luis, and nodded once. Luis looked down and froze. There it was. A headline, one line, no clickbait, no drama, just a simple caption beneath a photo. Keanu Reeves spotted dining quietly at his own restaurant in Los Angeles. Luis's eyes darted to table 8. The man was still there, still dressed in quiet, neutral tones, still unbothered, unflinching, still not saying anything. But everything suddenly made sense. He turned to Marcy, touched her elbow. "You need to see this." It moved like wildfire after that, but silently. No one screamed. No one ran to the table for a selfie. They knew better. The place wasn't that kind of restaurant. But the air turned electric. Phones lit up in pockets, brows furrowed in disbelief. Guests exchanged incredulous glances as they subtly scrolled their feeds under linen napkins and behind wine glasses. Staff whispered hurriedly behind polished counters and velvet curtains. Every single person who had seen him as a stranger now saw him as someone entirely different. Brad's knees actually buckled a little when he saw the headline for himself. The name hit him like a stone to the chest. He gripped the edge of the counter, jaw clenched, the snide comments he'd made earlier replaying in his mind like a broken film reel. "Do you even belong here?" Those words echoed now with a cruel irony that made him nauseous. And still, Keanu sat, calm, present, unmoved. As though none of this mattered. As though he wasn't one of the most recognizable names in the world. As though he hadn't just endured being mocked, dismissed, and nearly ejected from his own sanctuary. The revelation landed like thunder without sound. Michelle walked past him once more, this time slower. Her eyes found Brad's for a moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He had finally realized who he had insulted, and the weight of that truth, quiet, piercing, unrelenting, was far louder than any scolding ever could be. The doors didn't swing open dramatically. They never did. That wasn't how this place operated. It prided itself on subtlety, on elegance so understated you only noticed when it was gone. But when the man walked in, something shifted. Not in volume, not in posture, but in temperature. A hush fell over the staff hallway, and even the clinking of cutlery from the dining floor seemed to take a beat too long before resuming. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a perfectly cut dark charcoal coat. No flashy logos, no entourage, no unnecessary movement. Just presence. The kind that didn't have to announce itself, because the air already did. Michelle saw him first. She had been at the host's stand, running her eyes over the updated reservation list that suddenly felt irrelevant. Her shoulders straightened the second she recognized him, not because she feared him, but because she respected him. "Evening, sir," she said softly. He gave her a small nod. Not rushed, not curt. Just intentional, like everything he ever did. Brad caught sight of him next, peering from around the corner by the wine cellar. His breath caught. The shame that had started earlier now deepened into something else, remorse, raw and unshielded. He didn't say anything. He just stepped back, as if to hide. As if the owner's mere presence could peel back every layer of pride and show him the coward beneath. The man didn't pause. He walked slowly, eyes scanning the floor, not to inspect, but to witness. This was his space, not just by paper or deed, but by care. You could feel it in the way his gaze lingered on the corners others might miss, the corners that mattered. As he approached the dining room, a few guests lifted their eyes. Recognition flickered in some, but no one spoke. The air asked them not to. Then he turned, and his eyes found table 8. Keanu was still there. And when their eyes met two men, both calm, both quiet, something unspoken passed between them. A nod of familiarity, of friendship, of shared understanding. You could almost miss it if you blinked. But for those watching, really watching, it was like watching history whisper to itself. The owner walked the rest of the way to the table. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He simply arrived. Keanu looked up, smiled. Just barely. The owner smiled back. "Been a while," he said. Keanu lifted his glass slightly in greeting. "Figured I'd drop by. See how the place is holding up." The owner's eyes swept across the room, landing briefly on a waiter whose face had turned pale. He said nothing to him. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to Keanu and simply said, "You always did have perfect timing." And with that, the entire restaurant seemed to take a breath again, deeper this time, as if the universe itself had been waiting for that moment to fall back into balance. It didn't happen all at once. It began with a single gasp, sharp, involuntary, from the older couple seated nearest the kitchen corridor. The woman had just lifted her glass of Chardonnay when her eyes caught the interaction at table 8. Her hand stilled midair, eyes wide. Her husband followed her gaze, and his brow furrowed. Then, slowly, realization dawned on his face like morning light through dense fog. Others began to notice. A young woman at the bar, mid-sip of her lavender gin fizz, nudged her friend with a quick elbow. The friend turned her head, caught sight of the two men in conversation, and let out a breathy, "No way." Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. Words travel fast in rooms filled with anticipation. Phones didn't come out. Not here. That was an unspoken rule among the regulars. You didn't snap photos, didn't crowd. Not at this place. Not unless you wanted to be quietly escorted to the sidewalk with your dessert in a to-go box. But whispers? They were everywhere now. Is that really? No, it can't be. Wait, is that the owner? Oh my God. And Keanu's just... The staff tried to remain composed, but even they weren't immune. Behind the counter, Luis's hands trembled slightly as he polished a champagne flute for the third time. Marcy stood frozen by the maitre d' podium, blinking rapidly, as if trying to confirm that what she was seeing wasn't some trick of the lighting. Brad, still hovering near the side hallway, watched it all unravel. His collar suddenly felt too tight. He hadn't dared to move, hadn't even breathed too deeply since the owner entered. Now, watching the room come to life with quiet awe, his mistake bloomed with new, horrible clarity. The man he'd dismissed, the one he'd questioned, mocked, laughed about, was seated casually across from the one person in the building whose authority stood above reproach. They weren't just sharing a table. They were sharing history. Gasps turned into reverent murmurs. The atmosphere shifted from curious to electric. There was no announcement, no dramatic declaration. Just the truth, revealed plainly for those with eyes to see it. The stranger wasn't a stranger. The owner wasn't just an owner. And this wasn't just a dinner. It was a reckoning. Silent, graceful, deliberate. One that reminded every person in that restaurant of the simple, powerful lesson they'd almost forgotten. The worth of a man is not written on his clothes or etched on his face. It's felt in his presence and revealed always when the masks fall away. The silence in the room held like the last note of a symphony hovering in the air, full of weight, full of meaning. But the quiet didn't last long. Not once the owner turned his gaze from Keanu to the staff. He stood straight, the posture of a man who didn't have to raise his voice to command a room. His presence was enough, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't with anger or showmanship. It was with calm precision. "Everyone," he said, letting the word linger. Forks froze midair. A spoon clinked too loudly against porcelain in the back corner, and the woman who dropped it immediately looked down in embarrassment. Every head turned, like marionettes pulled by a single string. "This man," the owner continued, taking one step forward, not pointing, not gesturing wildly, just enough to make it clear who he meant, "owns the place." The words dropped like stone into water. The ripples reached everyone, even those who had pretended not to notice the earlier tension. It hit Brad like a freight train. He stumbled slightly, bracing a hand on the side wall. For a moment, it looked like he might say something, anything, but nothing came. His throat moved, his lips parted, and still no words arrived. Keanu didn't shift in his seat. He remained still, just as composed as he had been when the waiter had sneered, when the manager had told him to leave, when the staff had stifled laughter behind hands and menus. None of it had shaken him, because he hadn't needed to prove himself to anyone. But now the truth had been said out loud, clearly, unapologetically, and it echoed. Gasps gave way to stunned silence. You could feel people trying to remember what they had said about him, every judgment, every assumption. One guest quietly whispered to her husband, "I thought he looked familiar," trying to rewrite history in real time. The owner turned slightly toward Michelle, the only one on staff who had treated Keanu with anything resembling respect from the beginning. He gave her a small, knowing nod. "You've always had a good eye," he said. Her face warmed, and for a second, her eyes shimmered not with tears but with something like pride. A quiet, inner pride that said, "I knew. Even when they didn't, I knew." The owner's voice rose only slightly as he continued. "When you walk into a place like this, you expect to be welcomed, not judged, and certainly not dismissed." He looked around now, not just at the staff but the guests as well. His tone wasn't accusatory. It was reflective, almost gentle, but not soft. There was iron behind the velvet. "We built this restaurant to be a place of warmth, of kindness, where people could come as they are. No one should be treated differently because they don't wear designer shoes or ask for sparkling water." Somewhere in the back, a server lowered their head. Brad still hadn't moved. The owner glanced once more at Keanu, then back at the rest of the room. So let me say it again, clearly. This man is the reason this restaurant exists. He believed in it before the walls were built, before there were tables, before we had our first customer. He paused, letting that truth settle. He doesn't need to be recognized. He doesn't need applause. But he does deserve your respect. No one argued. No one dared. Keanu finally looked up then, just enough to meet the owner's eyes. There was no smile, no smugness, just a shared silence between two men who understood what it meant to carry dignity quietly. And as the owner gently pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, it was clear. Respect had finally arrived. Not because it was demanded, but because it had been earned. And now, revealed. The air had changed. Not in temperature, not in smell, but in weight. Every breath felt heavier, each moment slower, like time itself was kneeling beside the truth that had just been spoken. Brad stood near the wall, still half hidden behind a potted plant he'd once joked about being only for decoration. Now, it shielded him, barely, from the stares. Not from the guests, who had politely turned their attention elsewhere, but from the other staff. From Michelle, whose glance burned with a quiet disappointment. From Luis, who hadn't said a word in 10 minutes, but whose silence said everything. He'd been the loudest voice in the room just 20 minutes ago. The snide comments, the eye rolls, the laughter. And now? Now he was learning what silence could feel like when it wasn't yours by choice. Keanu sat at table 8, unchanged, still in his black tee, still with hair slightly tousled like the breeze had just run a hand through it, still quiet. He hadn't gloated, hadn't demanded an apology. He didn't need to. That would have made this something else about ego, about pride. But what had happened here wasn't about either of those things. It was about humility. The kind you carry quietly. The kind that doesn't beg to be noticed. The kind that waits while others misjudge you, and then offers grace instead of revenge. Brad stepped forward. Not because someone told him to. No one had. But because something inside him couldn't let it sit like this. He approached the table slowly, like each step carried its own confession. I didn't know, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Keanu looked up, eyes calm. He didn't blink. Brad fumbled. What I said earlier, the way I acted. I didn't recognize you. That was the excuse, wasn't it? The same one people always reached for. I didn't recognize you, as if humanity was owed only to those whose names made headlines. But Keanu didn't speak yet. He just waited, letting the words hang between them like a mirror. Brad shifted his weight, awkward in a way he hadn't been since his first week at the restaurant. You didn't deserve that. Keanu's voice, when it finally came, was steady, measured. No one does. Just 4 words, but they hit like a lesson. The kind you didn't read in a manual or hear in a seminar. The kind you felt, deep and unshakable. The kind that stuck with you, especially when it came from someone who could have humiliated you and chose not to. The owner, still seated across from Keanu, watched silently. He didn't need to say anything. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about a boy learning what it meant to be a man. And Brad? He wasn't a villain, just a product of habits he hadn't questioned, of a culture that taught him to judge by appearances, to defer to power, to look down when he should have looked within. But tonight, something cracked open, not in an explosive way, but slowly, like a door easing off its hinges. Thank you, Brad said. Not for forgiveness, he didn't expect that, but for the opportunity to face himself in front of someone he'd wronged. Keanu gave a nod, a small one, but one that mattered. Brad stepped back, quieter than he had ever been, but somehow more visible than ever before. Around the room, people had turned away respectfully, but they were listening. You could always tell. The stillness gave them away. The absence of forks on plates. The held breaths. It wasn't the apology that had moved them. It was the way Keanu had handled it. No gloating, no cruelty, just grace. And in that moment, as wine was poured and conversation slowly resumed, something deeper took root beneath the polished floorboards and ambient music. Respect is not commanded through fear. It's earned through humility, and wielded, most powerfully, in silence. The restaurant hummed with the soft clinks of silverware and murmurs of conversation, but the energy was unmistakably changed. The shift was subtle, like the feeling after a thunderstorm passes, when the air smells cleaner and the world feels strangely new. Keanu sat back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting gently on the edge of the white linen tablecloth. He didn't speak much. He never had to. People like him, people who move through the world with a quiet kind of knowing, spoke in their stillness. And tonight, that stillness had said more than most speeches ever could. At a nearby table, a teenage boy glanced over again, eyes wide. His parents, seated on either side of him, were trying to act casual, but their posture betrayed them. The father kept stealing glances. The mother whispered something beneath her breath, perhaps recognizing the man from a film or a story told over dinner years ago. But what none of them had expected, what none of them had ever imagined, was that the man being dismissed earlier, the one treated like background noise, was the very heartbeat of this place. It rattled something deep. Not just because he was famous, not just because he owned the restaurant, but because he didn't wear either of those truths on his sleeve. There had been no expensive suit, no entourage, no dramatic pause when he walked in, waiting for the room to notice. He hadn't demanded the best seat. He hadn't even asked for anything special. And still, he had been turned away, judged, mocked. And in that judgment, the truth of the evening was revealed. People often talked about respect like it was a currency, something to be exchanged, given in return for status, for titles, for aesthetics, for appearance. And yet the man who owned the room hadn't fit any of those criteria at a glance. He wasn't what they expected a wealthy man to look like. And that's where it all unraveled. Because respect, true respect, isn't about tailored jackets or designer watches. It isn't about walking in with confidence dripping from your pockets. It isn't about who recognizes your face or how many commas are in your bank account. Respect, at its core, is about how we choose to treat people before we know who they are. Keanu had been ignored by some, laughed at by others. But the moment his identity was revealed, the same people who'd brushed him off suddenly stood straighter, smiled wider, chose kindness, but too late, and only because of what they thought they stood to lose. Luis, one of the younger servers, couldn't help but stare. He'd been quiet throughout the night, not because he didn't notice what was happening, but because he had. Deeply. He leaned toward Michelle now, the only one who had greeted Keanu with genuine warmth from the beginning. "You knew, didn't you?" he asked softly. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk or nod dramatically, just answered with a soft smile and a shrug. Didn't matter to me if he was the owner or not, and that more than anything cut through the air like a bell. The lesson wasn't for Brad alone. It wasn't just for the staff or the guests. It was for everyone. In a world obsessed with surface, Keanu had reminded them of depth. In a place where perception shaped behavior, he had redefined presence. A man had walked in humbly, he had been treated poorly, and he had responded with grace. That's what made people remember nights like this. Not the meal, not the wine, but the story that unfolded between two chairs at table 8. The lesson didn't need repeating, but it echoed just the same. Respect is not earned by what's worn on the outside. It's revealed by how you treat those who wear less. That night, as the last guests filtered out and the lights dimmed to a softer hue, the restaurant exhaled. The clink of glasses, the rustle of napkins being folded, these sounds lingered like the final notes of a symphony. But beneath them, something else settled in. A stillness, a wait, a moment that would stay with everyone long after the doors were locked. The kitchen was clean, the tables were bare, but the air carried something no cloth could wipe away. Keanu had left the same way he came in, quietly, without a fuss, without a word of anger or judgment. There was no speech, no announcement, just a calm nod, a polite smile, and a kind of presence that lingered long after he was gone. Brad hadn't spoken since. He moved slower now, not out of exhaustion, but reflection. He had looked down on someone he didn't recognize, judged him by his clothes, his silence, his unassuming nature, and in doing so, he'd revealed more about himself than about the man he thought unworthy of a seat. Michelle and Luis exchanged glances across the room. No words needed. They both knew something had shifted, not just in the air, but in the way they'd think about their jobs, their guests, and their own assumptions. The revelation had stunned everyone, not because Keanu Reeves owned the restaurant, but because he had never needed anyone to know. He didn't carry his power like a sword. He didn't wield his name like a weapon. He walked in like anyone else, sat down like anyone else, hoped, perhaps foolishly, to be treated like anyone else. And yet, in being denied that simple dignity, he taught them something far greater than any reprimand ever could. Respect, they realized, is not a reward to be given once someone proves their worth. It is a choice you make before you know their name. That night wouldn't be remembered for the dishes served or the wine poured. It would be remembered because a man who could have demanded everything, demanded nothing, and still changed everything, without raising his voice, without lifting a finger, without needing to say a single word, just by showing who he truly was when it mattered most.